Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Feeling Smarter. As always, I'm joined by Tim Miller. G'day, Tim. How are you?
I'm going well, Aaron. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Good.
Well, today we're going to look at the topic of residency, and we have this week gone through our changing face of SMSF. And Tim, I guess a couple of things piqued your interest in reviewing some recent private binding rulings.
Yeah, look, I think it's interesting, Aaron, because we sort of trawl through all of the ATO private binding rulings to see what's been happening in the superannuation space. And one of the things which is super related, but it's income tax driven, is obviously the residency status of individuals. And whilst there's a lot of private binding rulings issued on residency status for income tax purposes, it sort of begs the question, because they get thrown in there every so often, is, does a self-managed super fund satisfy its residency requirements? And one of the key questions that often gets asked there is, how do we ensure that from an active member test, from a contribution point of view, but also from a central management and control, how do we know whether our absence from Australia is considered temporary or permanent?
Yeah, and of course, we have seen the unresolved matters from the budget a few years ago now on both those. We were seeing an extension of time of that temporary absence period from 2 years to 5 years.
Yep.
And there was also the recommendation to kind of repeal the active member test to really align self-managed super funds more broadly with superannuation entities themselves. And so both of those elements, I think, are not only crucial, obviously, to the tax concessions that exist, but understanding the nuances that exist within both of those. And I think the temporary absence one, if we kick off with that, getting that established at the very beginning is something that people, I guess, don't really put the attention on, because the view is they go, well, you can just be absent for a couple of years and then we need to look at it. But that's not necessarily the case.
No, and look, whilst you can, fix on the run, for want of a better term, in certain circumstances, it really is a preemptive measure. So you really need to be able to make that declaration that, okay, my absence is going to be temporary. I'm going to be away for a short period of time. I'm traveling for 12 months, but I have no desire to leave Australia. So you're going to satisfy the definition without too many problems. You then move into your non-standard scenarios, such as employment opportunities overseas, and therefore it's going to be dictated a little bit more by what are your actual circumstances going to be. So to satisfy that temporary absence requirement there, you still have to be retaining and maintaining assets in Australia, but you have to have every intention to return to Australia. So your intention is something that you ultimately know up front, or at least you assume you know it up front. And of course, intention changes. Yes. So that's why it's preemptive, in that at the outset, you have to say, well, I am moving overseas. I'm moving overseas for work. And if it's less than 2 years, I know I'm coming back to Australia, in which case you're going to satisfy the requirement. But if you're going to be away longer than that 2-year period, then knowing up front what your intention is pretty critical to be able to ensure that you can maintain that central management and control element of the fund with regards to being an active trustee.
Yeah, and the tax ruling on this talks about those sort of examples where the intention of an individual maybe migrating to the UK for work. Yep. Yes, the absence is temporary, but now potentially the role becomes permanent over there. So so it doesn't, even though we've got this kind of 2-year window, it doesn't just automatically stop at 2 years. Because it ultimately does come down to the circumstances of the individual at that particular time to say, well, they may just have a extension of their contract for a further 6 months. They're still intending on coming back. So therefore, the ATO would be satisfied that absence continues to be temporary.
That's right.
But we equally have an issue that if we get 18 months in, or even 12 months in, and we know that this is the job that's now going to be the job for life, well, the 2-year window is no longer relevant, because we've got to go back to the fact that there's going to be a permanent change to the individual circumstances going forward.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And you know, it's even a 1 day thing. I mean, if you know that that you're jumping on the plane and not coming back, then you shouldn't be making declarations that you intend to return. That you actually effectively can't be trustee from that point in time onwards, and have to have acted accordingly. And of course, the other subset of that is the predetermined time, but also that predetermined purpose. So, you know, we've seen instances of people moving overseas for medical treatment, and of course the period of time that treatment needs to be performed for will often be uncertain. And so if you can predefine the purpose of your trip, and that you will return on the completion of that purpose, that also satisfies the extended rule of temporary absence that the ATO have outlined.
Yeah. And I guess on the active member side, again, just from an understanding point of view, it's not always as clear as it seems. And I think, you know, if you think about children that might go overseas of the adult parents, and, you know, maybe they're part of the SMSF in a family fund sense or something.
Yeah.
And there can be circumstances where the active member test could actually still be met here, even though, you know, we have individuals that have gone overseas, as opposed to where they might be in their own fund and then they go overseas.
Yeah, and look, and I think this is probably again an extension of the contribution rules changing recently to up the age to age 75. Previously, an active member, you had to be a contributor. So if you had pension age parents and contributing children, even though the parents were the larger beneficiaries of the fund based on balances, you could still fail the test because they weren't active, because they weren't a contributor. And so now, if you do have that circumstance or that situation where the children do move overseas from a residency point of view for employment purposes, then, you know, it may not need much for the parents to make a contribution to be deemed an active member, and therefore to have more than the 50% balance requirement, which requires you to have at least 50% of active member balances being resident members. So,
yeah, absolutely. Well, these are just, I guess, many of the topics that, Tim, keep you busy each and every day, sort of drilling down and looking at what's happening. So yeah, if these sort of topics are of interest, naturally our Changing Face of SMSF and even our masterclass events, these are all good examples of topics that we cover and we deep dive into on an ongoing basis. So encourage you to have a look at our education page and our upcoming events to find out a little bit more about what we have throughout this year, and obviously as we move into 2024. So Tim, as always, great to chat.
Yep, always, Aaron. Speak to you next week.
See ya. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.